Why, hello there. Brent here with BYOTools, and on today's episode, if you want to see how we completely made a one-of-a-kind desk with 2x4s and a flame torch with a little bit of epoxy, well, keep on watching. Let's get started. So as you can see, there's a slight bevel on all four corners, and I want a nice, perfect, even surface to glue upon. So therefore, we're gonna cut about 1/8 of an inch off of both sides, and then glue the actual table together. So, let's start cutting.
For this project, I followed a couple parameters. First and foremost, I wanted to make sure the materials were easy to obtain, and secondly, and most importantly, they were cost effective. This is basically as simple as you're gonna get because these are just your generic 2x4s that are 8 feet long that you can get at any general hardware store. And as that be the case, this is also some of the most inexpensive lumber you can get for a table because for this project I purchased 10 2x4s and it cost me around $40. As for cutting the material, I would highly suggest acquiring a feather board, which is that big blue thing on my table saw, which basically just acts as a third hand and allows you to push the material up against the table saw fence, and therefore you have very little wiggle room when it comes time to actually pushing the piece of lumber down the saw blade, and therefore you get a much crisper, cleaner line in the long run.
Now that we have our boards fully flattened out, it's now time to glue them together. And the one tool to really help us do that is our biscuit joiner. Now this actually cuts perfect horizontal slits into our sides of wood, which inevitably fit perfectly with these biscuits. Now these don't provide any strength for the table whatsoever, but it does make it a lot easier to glue this entire table up versus trying to use a lot of clamps to even it out evenly. So, let's start biscuiting.
I first place a pencil line mark between each board, approximately 12 inches from each end as well as in the dead center. I also place a nice little star emblem on one side just to make sure I know exactly where these boards need to go back to because we're going to be flipping them back and forth and I don't want any confusion in the long run. I line up my biscuit joiner with the pencil line I made previously and then cut a perfect slit on each pencil line. Now for most woodworking projects, I would actually have my biscuit spaced approximately 12 inches from each other. However, I obviously have these spaced much further apart, mainly due to the fact that we're going to be lighting this thing on fire and I'm not going to be worried too much about the small minute differences between board to board. At this point, it's now time for glue up, and I'm actually using Titebond 3 for this application. Well, in all honesty, I did use Titebond 2 because I ran out of Titebond 3 at a certain point, but the only real difference in this application is one, Titebond 3 dries a little bit darker than Titebond 2, and Titebond 3 actually provides a little bit longer of a working time than Titebond 2. Just keep that in mind on your next woodworking project. As for the application of the glue, I'm just using a Rockler silicone glue brush, which works perfectly because glue does not stick to it, and therefore you can use it on multiple projects. I also highly suggest applying glue to both sides of each board, that way you can ensure you have proper glue coverage. And trust me, you're going to need that on this project because we are going to put these boards through the ringer. As for clamps, I'm using my standard 3/4 inch pipe clamp, which is one of my favorite clamps because one, is inexpensive, and it's extremely versatile because you can connect it to any 3/4 inch pipe as far as length goes, as long as it has a threaded end. I'll make sure to leave a link in the description box below on where to actually purchase these ones if you're interested. At this point in time, I'm just cleaning up some of the excess glue that spilled out once I tightened all my pipe clamps, and trust me, you're going to want to do that because the less glue you have to sand down, the better in this application. I let the table dry for approximately 24 hours and then remove all of my clamps. Now before sanding, I decided to remove the excess material on both ends that I need to cut down, which is approximately 6 to 8 inches on both sides. Just make sure you are accounting for this ahead of time so you don't have a biscuit that you're cutting straight through. I will decide to get a track saw one day, but before then, it's easy enough just to use a level with 2 clamps on both sides to ensure that you have a nice guide all the way across, which provides a perfectly clean, straight line. For heavy duty sanding where I really don't care too much about the finish, I always go straight to this variable speed disc sander by DeWalt. It's a perfect sander to remove a lot of material in a very quick, orderly fashion, as well as the fact that it has a shroud so you can actually collect the majority of all the dust with a shop vac connection system. The beauty about this shop vac is that you plug in your sander directly into it, and once you turn on the sander, it actually turns on the shop vac for you and turns it off simultaneously at the same time.
Okay, well, being that we are basically using a flamethrower to torch this tabletop, you gotta be careful. So I got a live hose, I got wet blankets, and a fire extinguisher. So just keep that in mind, especially if you're doing this type of torching, because I don't want to burn down my beautiful house. This is connected to a propane tank, as you can see. You're going to adjust it from this angle and basically open it up. Once you open it up, you prime it. And once it's primed, it is ready to go. Woo! So, as you can see, it doesn't take much. Now the fun begins.
This technique is called Shou Sugi Ban. I actually did some research just to try and pronounce it correctly, so if there are individuals that know how to pronounce it correctly, please let me know if I did. Apparently, it's an ancient Japanese wood burning technique which actually reduces the ability for wood rot, pest resistance, weather resistance, fire resistance, and UV resistance. So apparently there are quite a few advantages of doing something like this. Maybe not as quite as extreme as I took it, but inevitably the thought process behind this technique is actually beneficial for the longevity of wood. When working with fire, of course, the number one priority is safety first, so making sure that you're taking care of yourself as well as your surroundings is most important. But guess what? Slow motion is pretty sweet with fire, which I just have to obviously add because it's so cool, right?
So if you can see, this is basically a little bit more scorched than over here, and that's what I'm looking for. I want that gator skin look over this entire surface. So I'm basically planning on doing that to the entire surface and seeing what happens, but this is exactly what I'm looking for right here. Yep.
I had to leave this torch on for a significant amount of time in each specific area, and I tried a couple different techniques, whether that was staying on the same board and going from left to right, or going up and down, as you can see here, in more of a circular pattern, which actually worked out pretty well. By no means is my technique scientific, but I basically was just leaving it on there in order to have a consistent char all the way across. Now there are different layers of char that you could also put on this. This is definitely more of a significant layer, and if I wanted to, I could really let this thing burn and see what happens. But the one thing I wanted to be considerate of is making sure that I did not heat this table up to the point where the structurability and the integrity of the actual table was in jeopardy due to the fact that I glued these boards up. So you do have to take that in consideration on this specific project, because it's not just wood we're talking about wood and glue.
Now, as you can see, there's quite a significant dip in the middle due to the fact that we took a large blowtorch to this thing and just curled up on both sides. What I'm going to do to try and minimize it is I'm actually going to flip it over and burn the back side to try and at least even out slightly. We'll see how it does, but that way we can use less epoxy in the long run.
Full disclosure, I really didn't know if this was actually going to work, but I'm super happy with that I did it this way because it actually flattened out almost perfectly just by applying a little bit of heat on the backside as well as some much needed pressure by me standing on it. It completely flattened out within 10 minutes of blowtorching. At this point in time, it's now time for epoxy, and of course we are using our Total Boat high performance epoxy for this tabletop pour. It's a 2-part 2-to-1 mixing ratio, so just keep that in mind when you're mixing thoroughly, and it provides a perfectly crystal clear finish in the end. With a lot of the epoxies that I use, especially the ones that are in my garage during the winter, they tend to thicken up a bit. What I always suggest doing before you start pouring is placing the epoxy into a tub of hot water for just 5 minutes. It reduces the viscosity and actually makes it a lot easier to pour thoroughly over the entire span. All I use to spread out the epoxy is just a thin plastic spreader. And that's really all that you need in order to have a nice flat surface, because this liquid will be self-leveling. As for the edges, I do take a foam brush to apply the epoxy because it makes it a little bit easier to get a proper consistency of epoxy on all the edges. Once I have my first coat fully applied, I then take my torch, my small torch, and apply a bit of heat just to pop all those small miscellaneous air bubbles. At this point, remember, this first coat is really only a seal coat because you want to seal in all that beautiful burnt wood and bark that was created with the larger torch. It also reduces the chances of more air bubbles coming to the surface after you apply your second coat because you already have those small gaps in the wood completely covered with epoxy.
Now after our first coat, I did realize that there are more drips coming off of this corner, which inevitably is because I did not level that corner first. So make sure you double check, make sure things are level. If they're not level, go ahead and put a shim right underneath there, level it out, and that way it will avoid excessive drips on one edge versus all the others. Now, let's pour the second coat.
I let the first coat of epoxy dry for approximately 2 hours, and at this point, the epoxy is basically tacky to the touch. And as you can see, the color and the beauty is already coming out. But we gotta make sure it's perfectly smooth, which is what the secondary flood coat is all about. Because the first coat is still tacky, you'll have perfect adhesion between the two coats. Now, full disclosure, I have to give full credit to fellow YouTuber Cam over at Blacktail Studios. He is an amazing woodworker and actually learned this burning and epoxy technique on his channel, and I loved it so much I had to do it on mine, and I will leave a link in the description box below on where to find the video that's inspired this project. As the epoxy is wet, you do want to remove all the drip edges if possible at that point with just your finger. However, if it does dry thoroughly, go ahead and just take some 300 grit sandpaper and sand it smooth, and guess what? Drips be gone. As for the backside, all I do is apply a bit of Halcon Clear by Total Boat to seal in that beautiful burnt wood look. It doesn't have to be epoxy because no one's ever going to see it, but I do want to make sure it's fully sealed because I don't want to have an exposed wood char on the bottom of my table, and every single time I touch the bottom of the table, my hands are black. No one wants that, except, I don't know, maybe coal miners. I apply the Halcon Clear with a foam roller and just distribute the solution as evenly as possible over the entire backside. Once that clear coat is dry, I want to step it up a bit with a bit of technology, and I actually take a couple items from Doug Mockett. This first one is specifically a wireless charging pad that's hidden because it's actually underneath the table. I actually installed this in a previous project and I loved it so much I wanted to install it on this one as well. The nice thing about this kit is that it actually comes with this specific bit, which gives you a perfect dimension as well as a setting screw so you know exactly what depth you need to set to so you don't go too deep. I actually personally screwed up the placement of the first one, but luckily it blends in perfectly with a little bit of fire. At this point, go ahead and insert the charger, then put a set screw in place, and it's ready to be powered up. I also wanted to install a USB unit from Mockett as well because not all devices can charge wirelessly. Now comes time to actually fixing up this whole office space. Yes, I know it's pretty ridiculous, and yes, it is not the most professional looking, but that's why I'm trying to make over this space into something much more enjoyable that you actually want to sit at. I am making a rail system to actually support the tabletop. I'm not going to go into too much detail other than the fact that I'm using a tube steel that I'm going to be placing onto the wall, because in my next video I'm going to be showing how to install a brick stencil system on the wall for a more decorative look, as well as hook this tabletop up to an adjustable height desk. So please stay tuned for that one. But at this point, all we have to do is plug in our Mockett units, and guess what? We are done! I truly loved learning new skills and trying new things, and this project was something that I took on for the very first time, and I didn't know what was going to be in store for me, but it turned out absolutely beautiful, and I love how I was able to incorporate a few smart gadgets along the way, as well as the fact that this finish turned out absolutely beautiful. It's a charred metallic look almost. It was actually hard to capture the finish on film, so please leave a comment down below on what you think of this finish. Now comes time to putting this whole workspace back together, and it's a perfect way to introduce today's sponsor, which is Carl Friedrich. They specialize in making high quality leather goods that are manufactured in Tuscany, Italy, and the fact that I'm a dual citizen with Italy just means that I have to love that. It is the season right now for gift giving, and if you want 15% off, please check out the link below and type in BYOTee 15 at checkout. I love products that you can automatically tell the high quality aspect of it just by touching it, and Carl Friedrich is no exception to that. It's beautiful, it's sleek, and just like my desk, it's one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.